Oh, there we go. So the Assistance Fund, we're a 501c3 independent charitable assistance program, and we help underinsured patients and their families that are facing high out-of-pocket costs for rare, life-threatening, and chronic diseases. So we manage more than 70 disease-specific programs. Over half of our funds are rare, which is why we are so involved in the rare disease space. We provide 3 different types of assistance: copay assistance, premium assistance, and assistance with medical incidentals. 85% of our current patient population are Medicare patients. So you may be wondering why we've been so involved, if you've been engaged in the Washington community, in the Medicaid space. TAF is very aware that 95% of all human diseases still do not have an FDA-approved treatment. We know that the majority of new drug approvals are rare, and that market is expected to explode in the coming decade. So we realize there's going to be an even greater need, hopefully especially for the pediatric population, to access new treatments and therapies. Since 2009, we've served nearly 135,000 individual patients and provided over $1 billion in assistance. And this is what I do. So in 2019, the Assistance Fund, which is headquartered in Orlando, Florida, opened a Washington, D.C. office. And our goal was to try to ensure that all patients, regardless of socioeconomic status, have access to all of the treatment, therapy, clinical care, and diagnosis that they require, regardless, again, of their socioeconomic status. And this is something that's a huge problem throughout the country. We have a huge undiagnosed population in the rare community. Patients, if a treatment does exist, often have a very tough time accessing it. And even clinical care and therapies like occupational therapy, speech therapy, physical therapy, anything that these, especially pediatric populations, require, can be very difficult to obtain. So this is actually a personal issue for me. So I started my career 20 years ago in Washington at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and worked in the Secretary's Budget Office, was there for the creation of BARDA, which thanks to COVID is now a household name. And I really thought that I was helping. And then Charlotte was born, and she was born in 2016. She has a rare neurogenetic disorder. Thankfully, we were able to obtain a diagnosis, but despite my history in health policy, despite having spent my career working with scientists and clinicians, living 2 blocks from the NIH, it took me a year to get that diagnosis. And our clinicians at Children's National, world-class medical geneticists, spent an inordinate amount of time writing letters to the insurance companies asking for whatever tests they saw fit. So we did a whole litany of tests, and finally in September of 2018, they requested a whole exome sequencing. My husband was then employed with Booz Allen Hamilton, a self-insured Fortune 500 company. We had the best insurance money can buy, and they denied it. They deemed it experimental. Now, we were able to move forward anyway, and we did, and we achieved this diagnosis. So in December of 2018, she was diagnosed with NA10-related disorder, de novo. It can just happen. It can be your kid, it can be your grandkid, your niece, your nephew. These things happen more frequently than I could have ever imagined. So the first thing I did was try to figure out who was working on this. And we were very lucky to have Dr. Golson Lyon, and he is based at the Institute for Basic Research and Developmental Disabilities in New York State. And he was able to obtain an NIH grant to do a natural history study, which we all know is the first step in trying to find a treatment. So in January of 2020, we went there and participated in his study. So since that time, I've been very passionate about access to diagnosis. So I also sit on the board of Global Genes, and we recently issued, and Kari worked quite a bit on this too, Access to Critical Therapies Guiding Principles, and Kari and I co-chair an access working group that is ongoing. But the very first principle in here is timely and sustainable access to diagnosis, which unfortunately is something that we have not achieved in this country. Whether it's a gene panel, whole exome sequencing, whole genome sequencing, it's very difficult to access. So this is something that I think we need to fix, and this is something that's obviously in the patient's best interest, but it's also in the best interest of the pharmaceutical industry, because they really want to understand the entirety of their patient population so they can develop the best possible products. And now I want to talk a little bit about the next steps. There is a lot happening legislatively, and I'm not sure, is anybody in the room familiar with the 21st Century Cures legislation? Yep, okay. So as you probably know, there's a discussion draft for Cures 2.0, which is the next step for all of this. And in that discussion draft, there is Medicaid coverage for genomic sequencing. There's also a whole litany of additional items that would be very influential for the rare disease community. And so I've posted up here a photo of the discussion draft and the section by section, which you can find online, and I'm happy to share after this. But we really encourage everyone, if you haven't yet, make sure you weigh in with Representatives Upton and DeGette, and make sure you've taken a look at this and see what needs to be done for your communities, for the rare community writ large. And at the Assistance Fund, we are trying to bring everyone together to ensure that the rare disease community's priorities are reflected in Cures 2.0. So please do get in touch with me after this if this is something you're interested in working on. Another exciting initiative, which is happening alongside Cures 2.0, you may have heard President Biden's joint address to Congress earlier this year. He talked about ARPA-H, or the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health. This would prioritize at present cancer, Alzheimer's, and diabetes, which we all know are some of the already top funded and prioritized disease states in the nation. Our hope is that we can ensure rare diseases are prioritized here. So the White House did publish an article in Science, so it's the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, Eric Lander's group. And I'm sorry, I think I skipped a slide. Oh, and I think there's also, I'm supposed to have a slide in here that shows you the NIH is also, they've convened a whole slew of listening sessions. So on the NIH website, oh sorry, it's this one right here, it got cut off, but you can actually go and see all the listening sessions that they held. I did make comments asking them to prioritize rare. I know a number of people have sent letters in. Matt Might from the NGLY1 community recently published a piece in Stat News also asking for rare diseases to be prioritized in ARPA-H, but this is something that we would highly encourage all of you to engage in if you haven't already. I think if rare does not come together and demand that White House OSTP and the NIH ensure rare diseases are prioritized, they won't be. So this is another thing that we're trying to really ensure happens at the Assistance Fund. Now that brings me to this larger question of, we want rare diseases in ARPA-H, but we've also seen success already with BARDA, right? So we created BARDA to pull countermeasures through to market faster, right? We knew that if we had a chemical, radiological, biological, or nuclear incident, we didn't have the appropriate countermeasures available. We knew that if we had an influenza pandemic, we would need vaccines and antivirals. And there was an incredible multi-billion-dollar effort that went into paving the way for what we now see with COVID and all the vaccines that are on the market. So we created a system that can pull products through to market faster. And we've all seen with COVID as well, that the regulatory system can move quickly when we need it to. With DARPA, we've also seen, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency that's been around for quite a while, and that's what they're modeling ARPA-H after. This was designed to improve our warfighting capabilities. And then IARPA, the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Agency, has also been around for a long time. So Simon, in a talk earlier today, had mentioned that the biopharmaceutical industry currently has to take on a lot of risk, and we heard from the speaker immediately prior, he had to come up with dollars himself to be able to find a treatment. A lot of these success stories, we've also heard Emil Kakis and Mark Dant and Aldurazyme, these are one-offs, unfortunately. They're very unusual. They almost never happen. So what Simon and I have been discussing for a while is, why don't we have a BARDA why don't we have a rare advanced research projects agency or a rare advanced development agency that could take on some of the risk, that could try to commercialize products that companies can't. There are a number of barriers currently. I was talking to, there's a little boy, I don't know if you've seen this movie, it's on HBO. It's called Life According to Sam, and it's a little boy, Sam. He had progeria. He died a few years ago. And his mother, Dr. Leslie Gordon, she was an MD, PhD before Sam was born, dedicated her life to finding a treatment for progeria. And I was lucky enough to have a call with Leslie Gordon a week or so ago. And I told her that I was personally getting very frustrated about what was going on with my daughter and her disease, what I was seeing going on across the rare disease community, all of these barriers that we have in place. We aren't able to get children who are dying into clinical trials. We aren't, if we get them in, half of them are put on placebo a lot of the time. And Leslie told me that, she's frustrated. There are so many barriers that they've identified that we know we can overcome. This stuff isn't rocket science. But we still can't, we don't have enough AAV9 manufacturing capacity. There's difficulty beyond even the diagnosis with the different animal models, right? Like the natural history studies. Everything is a big barrier that if we came together and we put enough resources behind it, we could do it. Our society just hasn't made the choice yet. But she did tell me, and this is something that really stuck with me, you have to keep going, you have to keep talking about it, because you never know what the trickle-down effect is going to be. You never know who's going to be listening. You never know who's going to take something away from what you're trying to do and carry that torch forward. And the previous speaker also mentioned, it's not about his kids, right? It's about the kids that come next. And I think we all, parents in the rare community, we share that mentality. We hope to help our children, and we're doing the best that we can, but we know that this is bigger than even our one child or our families, and that's what keeps us going. And then just briefly, I also wanted to point out, the case has been made that rare diseases are a public health priority. And so this is something that I don't think we can allow the policymakers to ignore any longer. This is something Chris Austin and Francis Collins had talked about at one of the more recent rare disease weeks, but the case has been made. And the Every Life Foundation also put out a burden study showing that there's a cost of $1 trillion to society from rare diseases. Like the data doesn't lie. I mean, this analysis has been done. So again, I wanted to turn it over to Simon to say a few words as well. But I can tell you, a lot of people forget the Department of Health and Human Services. This is the largest department in the federal government. When you add CMS in there, this is far bigger than the Department of Defense. The NIH, the FDA, CDC, CMS, if we could create an entity like BARDA in the Office of the Secretary, focused on rare, there's no reason we couldn't facilitate the development of more products and bring the work that NCATS is doing, the work they envision for ARPA-H forward. And I think that that's what our children deserve. So Simon, did you want to say a few words about your work and your vision for this?
Yeah, sure. So can you hear me clearly enough on this thing? Okay, good. So I talked a little bit this morning about how this needs to be a coordinated public effort. It's at the moment, Scott Dorfman, he spoke just before us. I thought he was really articulate about this. He said, the only diseases that are getting all the way through to approval are the ones that are led by not parent advocates, really parent scientists that start understanding all of these little silos that you need to coordinate in order to get all the way through the system. And that's not good enough, right? That's not good enough because first of all, they're laymen, right? They're not able to do it. Second of all, they have to reinvent the wheel every time. And there's a far more efficient process to do it. And the way that we're doing it now, with parents leading the way essentially for a handful of diseases, is that we're only getting a handful of diseases through to approval status. So we have to treat 9,000 diseases. Not only do we have to treat those 9,000 diseases, but we have to come up with multiple therapies for each disease. So it's so insignificant right now what we're doing as a society. It's so de minimis that it's negligible. And we can't pat ourselves on the back as a society and say, hey, we're putting 30 different therapies through getting it to the approval status, and maybe getting 3 through approvals. I don't want to swear, but that's terrible. That's how bad that's terrible. You can't pat yourself on the back for that. So I feel like the only way for us to do this is to take a coordinated public response. $1 trillion a year in treating symptoms is not okay when you're spending virtually nothing on R&D as a society. Because that $1 trillion, it falls on the shoulders of the rare disease community, and they can't afford it, so it falls on the taxpayer, right? Medicaid, Medicare. And when it falls on the shoulders of the taxpayer, you're paying for it anyway. So why don't we instead try to keep people out of hospitals, keep them out of doctor's visits, stop having to pay so much in medication, and instead have a good life for those kids. And one last point, I'm taking too much time. One last point is that, I've heard this so many times, a cheap patient is a dead patient, right? I mean, first of all, I'm not even going to discuss the morals of that, but that's not true. My child's disease, and I've also got a child with a heterozygous mutation that's de novo. My child's disease, those kids live until they're 30, 40 years old, and they have end-of-life costs all that time, right? $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 a year, and you guys are paying for it, right? And we can't afford that. We can't afford it as a society because we've got better ways to do it if we take a systematic approach.
Yeah, thanks for that. And that's actually interesting that you bring that up, because we've been having a lot of conversations about this access to diagnosis issue. And one of the things I've heard from the clinicians at Children's National that's just shocking is when they request from insurance companies approvals to perform prenatal testing, they're always approved. There's not an issue. But once the child is born, that's when, like in my daughter's experience, you're fighting to achieve a diagnosis. And once that diagnosis is achieved, the insurer then has to cover a treatment if it exists. They have to cover all these expensive therapies, the speech, the OT, the physical therapy, the behavioral therapy. It's not cheap. And if we don't find a way to have treatments and cures that work, we're never gonna change the paradigm, so. And then I also wanted to turn to Kari. Kari runs the TSC Alliance and is an expert on tuberous sclerosis, and also co-chairs again this Global Genes Access Working Group with me, which we're very focused on achieving diagnosis and a number of other things. But what's interesting is they found that even once you achieve obtaining a treatment and you have that available, the out-of-pocket cost can be unsustainable. And even when the patent life ends and you have some of these generic competitors come onto the market, we're finding, and we've heard the same thing, we're talking about this from the MS Society, that the out-of-pocket costs still are not sustainable. So Kari, did you want to comment a little bit about this and what you're seeing here, even for those folks that are lucky enough to have a treatment?
Absolutely. So there are 2 experiences we've had with treatment options that have been used in tuberous sclerosis complex. The first is vigabatrin, that is used to literally stop infantile spasms, extremely effective in TSC, and Afinitor, which is used for seizures and to reduce tumor growth in TSC. So when vigabatrin went off the market, and this is really important for lifespan, right? We all want treatments, but what happens at the end of the lifespan of these treatments? So what we saw was when generics came on the market, all of a sudden parents didn't have that umbrella of emergency supply that they had previously from the brand company that had such a robust and wonderful patient assistance program. What we saw were people that started on brand being switched to generics without their knowledge and breakthrough seizures when maybe their children had been seizure-free. What we saw was doctors' offices with piles of prior authorizations, and we were scrambling behind the scenes to make sure that these babies really got this life-saving medication in a timely manner, because time is brain. And with infantile spasms, with every spasm, that's one day closer to intellectual and developmental disabilities. So it was a crisis in our community. Further to that, we know that states like California, where there is a generic, they won't accept co-pays from brand. So what we were seeing is people paying more out of pocket than they were, and sometimes prohibitively. And I'll just talk a little bit about Afinitor. So Afinitor went off patent for the 2.5, 5, and 7.5 milligram options, but not for 10 milligrams and not for dispersed. So it's very confusing to a community, to a physician's office. And what we found at the beginning of this past year is that as people were being switched to generics from brand and not being told, they were being billed $3,000 out of pocket. So we worked very hard with industry to try and fix what we could, at least for the people that could enroll in a patient assistance program still, while there's still a few doses that are still on patent. I'm actually not sure what's going to happen next year when it's fully generic. So those are just some challenges with access that have really kept our community at a distance from being able to easily access medications. And there's just a publication a family sent me. It took them a month when their company, the dad's company, switched PBMs to get Afinitor for their child who had been on it for 2 years. That's unbelievable. What we know about Afinitor and TSC is that it shrinks tumors, but when you stop taking the medication, the tumors grow back. These tumors are in the brain and on the kidneys, and that can cause a life-threatening situation. So this is not okay.
Yeah, those delays can really wreak havoc. And I know Kari and I work a lot with Brett Copeland, who chairs the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine's foundation. And he recently moved his family to Colorado. He has a little girl with epidermolysis bullosa, which is an absolutely devastating disease where the children completely lose their skin, they have constant blistering, and they die very early. And Brett's challenge was he runs Deborah of America, which is an epidermolysis bullosa patient group, and the insurance company continued to raise the premiums because the bandages for these children cost tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. They're prohibitively expensive. So, whether it is treatment, whether it's therapy, whether it's, things like bandages or other durable medical equipment, patients every day we're finding they can't access these basic things even when they exist. And that doesn't bode well for all of these 21st century treatments and cures that the industry is working so hard to bring online. We need to figure out how to fix our completely broken healthcare system, move it into the 21st century, or we will not accommodate these 21st century treatments and cures. So I think we've got to find a way to work together, prioritize rare, and tell these policymakers things have got to change. And the other challenge, Kari mentioned, children that have these crises, especially when they have seizures and they lead to major developmental disabilities or brain injuries. My daughter Charlotte, she's one of those kids that will never progress. So she didn't regress. She never progressed in the first place. So she is developmentally, 1 or 2 years old. And I'll never forget when we went to see Golson Lion in New York. He said to me, well, Christina, I had all these tests prepared for all these NA10 girls, and the children needed to be at least developmentally a year old. And these kids, some of them are 8, 9, 10. The 1-year-old tests were too much. I mean, that's the level of functioning that we're talking about. And I can tell you, it is devastating. I mean, it is life-altering for your entire family and for society, and I just think that we can do so much better at trying to figure out how to get these kids what they need, try to figure out what's going on in their brains, because there are applications beyond. It's not just one little child. It's not just this tiny little population of 100 kids. I mean, the NA10 girls, that NA10 gene encodes for the acetylation of 40 to 50% of all proteins in the human body. I mean, there's so much knowledge that we know is going to be valuable beyond these kids, but we have to find a way, I think, Simon has said, collectively to work together on this. And there are just some things I think that the pharmaceutical industry can't do alone, right? Did you want to comment a little bit more on any of that?
Yeah, So I talked a bit about risk this morning and what type of risk the pharmaceutical companies face. And when you look at it, it's really astounding that they can even get out of the starting blocks. What they have to do is essentially, they have to prove to, and I won't say it all again because I think some of you were in the first one, but I'll give you the worst example. So the worst example is they have two sets of judges. One set of judges, the FDA, is essentially judging them on whether or not they have something that's already been developed and approved, right? And then the patent office is judging them on exactly the opposite, right? They have to have something that has never been developed and approved, and it has to be unique. So one set of, you have to reinvent the wheel first of all, then you have to prove that that reinvented wheel looks nothing like a wheel, and also exactly like a wheel. So how do you do that? And that's just one example of the challenges that pharmaceutical companies face. And why would they start if they know that they've got that ahead of them?
Thank you. And Kari, you and I had a conversation, I think it was over a year ago now, but about some of the challenges that patients have even accessing clinical trials. Is that something that you think we could do some more work on as well, in terms of working with the pharmaceutical industry and beyond even identifying them, trying to make sure that they're able to participate and making it easier to capture?
Yeah, I also think this goes to what we're dealing with as society in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. If you are a family that's barely getting by and you have to take a full day off from work to participate in a clinical trial, it really can be prohibitive. I think one thing that's come out of the pandemic is telehealth and people rethinking how to do clinical trials remotely so that it makes it more accessible for families of all races, ethnicities to participate, and all ages and all abilities. And I think that's really important. And then what we do at the TSC Alliance also is to help with travel and lodging for families to participate in clinical trials because we want them to be successful. We want new treatments to be moved forward, and so we've taken responsibility for helping with that. But I think that we can do it differently, more efficiently, and not put so much burden on families.
Thank you. And I'm not sure, how much time do we have left? Do we have time for a few questions? Oh, we do. Okay, do we want to do some questions from the audience? Yeah? Yes, you in the back.
Thank you. So, based on the presentations here, you have a fairly substantial agenda. You want to change the everyday, the back office, you want to get the healthcare system fixed, legislation through. And my expectation is next year when the three of you are going to tell us how you did all of that. But seriously, you talk about working together, and you talk about, and you had one alliance, you had another alliance. Who coordinates this, and how do you set priorities? Because I've done some work in TB. Wound healing is a big thing, and it's a problem, but it's not a therapy, right? It's not a solution to the disease, but absolutely instrumental in terms of helping these patients do better. So what's your vision of, what's your first baby step going to be before you kind of get, they're not insurmountable problems, but the mountain's pretty high. So how are you going to start that process?
No, I think that's a great question. What I would like to see, and I'm somebody who, again, I've been in Washington for 20 years. I'm turning 40 next month. I've been kind of, going through that midlife crisis of what have I done with my career? And when I first came to Washington, I saw so many incredible things happen. I mean, we passed the Medicare Modernization Act that created Medicare Part D, right? We created BARDA, which, now we've had success with a whole number of products coming to market. We passed the Affordable Care Act, right? We made sure that insurance companies couldn't discriminate against people with pre-existing conditions. Like, things have progressed. But what's been really interesting to me since coming into the rare disease space, and I have to confess that until Charlotte was born, I didn't know this space existed. I spent the first part of my career in infectious diseases. I then worked in non-communicable diseases, things that had a lot of resources, had a lot of attention. And then Charlotte was born, and I walked in and met this incredible rare disease community. But what really struck me, and what still strikes me today, is the fragmentation in that community. And I can tell you, a story. I was representing at one point the American College of Cardiology, which is a college of 53,000 cardiologists in America. And there may be $100 million a year organization. And we worked a lot with the American Heart Association, which is a grassroots $1 billion a year organization. And the leadership of these two entities was coming together because we wanted to make sure that the US dietary guidelines for Americans said what we thought they should say on cholesterol. And if you've ever seen this, it's a document that comes out from HHS and USDA, and it's heavily lobbied and influenced by industry. And the White House called me and said, "Hey, Christina, we are hearing different things from AHA and ACC, and we don't know what the heck we're supposed to put in here. So we're just gonna listen to the egg industry." And the egg industry won that one, right? So we couldn't, the cardiovascular community couldn't figure it out, couldn't come together and figure out what to tell the White House they should put. I'm seeing the same thing with rare, and now it's personal, right? Now it's my daughter, it's Simon's daughter. I mean, it's personal now. And so what I would really like to see is all of the leaders in the rare disease community, the NORD, the National Organization for Rare Disorders, Global Genes, the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases, the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine Foundation, all of these groups, and there's more, these umbrella groups come together, put together, a agenda of what we want to see happen. We can put it against a timeline. It's going to be 10 or 20 years. But I think that's how we would achieve some of these objectives, and I think it's entirely doable if we have the will. So that's my thoughts, but I want to hear also from Simon and Kari.
I love that question because it's exactly the right question. You want to change the world, okay, tell us how. That's a great question. Now, not advocating changing the FDA, obviously, but there are so many different parts of this problem that have low-hanging fruit, right? So one example of that is we've got a really good one side of an equation in terms of that $1 trillion that it costs patients per year. Well, let's figure out how much we can save by producing therapies. Let's figure out how we can create homogeneous therapies, like AAV-mediated gene therapy. There's a delivery of a functional copy of a gene. Well, that can be done for multiple diseases. So let's figure out how many diseases we should try that on and use a public initiative to do that. That's achievable. Whole genome sequencing for all is another thing that's incredibly achievable, right? And once you do that and you centralize those genetic data and layer on top of that some phenotypic data and start correlating inside and outside of diseases, well, there's something else that's achievable. So these things, I think, we've got steps that we can take to get there. There's a few puzzle pieces, but they've been solved, and they've been solved disease by disease. I'm advocating that we do this for more diseases than one at a time.
So I would say that our entire system is not built for rare disease. It's something that's talked about in the white paper from Global Genes that Christina, that image, maybe go back because people can get it on the Global Genes website. I think we have a very unique opportunity to get the White House's attention to work with us to begin to think about change in our entire system. It's expensive, drugs are expensive. We hear a lot about that from Congress, but not a lot about fixing the system. And I think it is systemic, and I think Christina's right in that we need to come together, but we need to get the White House's attention to do that. And the whole listening system, sessions that you talked about, Christina, were so important to have the rare voice there. And we need to continue to advocate for a seat at the table, because I think that is how we're going to instigate change. But we need to do it with one big, gigantic voice, just like the disability community has done previously.
Thank you. And I see Megan O'Boyle.
So completely outraged on all levels. We need homework. I I'm supposed to. I don't think we can do this one senator at a time. And I will be more outraged if NORD and other organizations can't come together on this, because there are lives at stake. I've seen organizations pit against each other in diseases, both common and rare, and I don't think there's room for that here. But what's our timeline for getting the White House's attention? We know they have the attention of cancer. We also know that the research in rare cancers led to treatments of common cancers. The research in rare disease will lead to treatments of common disease, and this is all, bipartisan. So, teacher, what is our homework assignment?
Great question, thank you. I did not plant Megan in the audience, but
Sure you did.
So I can tell you that the assistance fund, and I think someone had asked, what is the assistance fund? Well, we are a 501c3 nonprofit. We're actually one of the 100 largest charities in the nation. So we are lucky to have the resources to be able to do this kind of advocacy work in Washington. And again, we have 70 disease-specific funds, chronic, rare, a whole litany of different things, but the majority of our funds are rare. And I think that we all realize that is only going to grow as time goes on. So the assistance fund is committed to the rare disease community. So my CEO, Mark McGreevy, has empowered me to try to convene as many of these groups as possible. And so there is a meeting that we're having in September. I currently have commitments from Julia Jenkins at the Every Life Foundation, from Nicole Boyce at Rare X, from Craig Martin at Global Genes, from Brett Copeland, who chairs the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine Foundation, from Matt Might, who is at the University of Alabama, but he spent a lot of time in the White House, so he's been really helpful in terms of guiding us. The one group I do not yet have is NORD, and I'm hoping to really bring them to the table. And if there are any other big umbrella groups that go across rare, we do want to pull them in. But then, Megan, I think once we have that meeting and those commitments, from the leaders of these rare organizations, we then can work with Every Life to activate through their rare disease legislative advocates. We can do action alerts. TAF also has an advocacy action alert system set up. Many different groups do. Global Genes is really interested in activating their Foundation Alliance, which has, I think, 800 or 900, I think Christian left, but hundreds of tiny little rare disease organizations together. NORD has this 30-year history, passing the Orphan Drug Act. They have some of that name recognition in Washington, so we'd really like to pull them in too. But we really need, all of you, the constituents, to come together and tell the leaders of these different organizations, you must come to the table. You must be part of this conversation. And then we're going to request these meetings with the White House. We've got a friend in there, Max Bronstein, who's reporting to Eric Lander. Many of you know Eric Lander himself, right? So we're going to request that meeting. We have some major advocates in HHS now. Sarah Desprez helped make antibiotics a priority when we were at the Pew Charitable Trust. We can do this for rare too. She's in there, Andrea Palm, who ran the Domestic Policy Council in the Obama White House. She's now the #2 at HHS. These are really seasoned policy professionals who will hear these arguments. We just have to make the case. Francis Collins has been a huge advocate for rare at the NIH. I think they're all willing to hear from us, but we have to come together, and it has to be united rare community. I see Dean. Last question, I think, right?
Megan and I will cause all kinds of trouble. I would just say, in light of the question and the answer is there a page, is there a sign-on letter that we can put together that you as a neutral party, or wherever you are in this, can say, these are the people that are asking all the rest of you to do this. Take this, at least sit down and talk and tell us about it.
Yes, and we absolutely do have a letter, so we can get that out. Yes, so please do, everybody. If you don't already have my email, I'm happy to share it. And we all, I think a lot of us know each other already, but really look forward to working with all of you. And thank you again for taking the time to be with us this afternoon.